Welcome. Welcome to all of you here on the first edition of The Crow's Nest, which is a live show done each week, somewhat of an outgrowth of the recent to launch, as in next week, School of Mythopoetics, of which I am a co-steward and co-founder. And the intention of this weekly show is to bring a mythopoetic lens, a mythopoetic wondering on more of the topical themes and events of the day. And, for this initial episode, I'm delighted to be welcomed by, dare I say, my friend, colleague, ally, Sophie Strand. Welcome, Sophie.
Thanks for having me, Ian. I'm honored to be the first.
I'd love to share a little bit about your background as well. I mean, certainly if people have been following the school for a little while and your own writings and wonderings, they're very familiar with you. But Sophie Strand is a writer based in the Hudson Valley who focuses on the intersection of spirituality, storytelling, and ecology. Her first book of essays, The Flowering Wand, Rewilding the Sacred Masculine, will be published by Intertradition in fall of this year and is available now to pre-order. I'm very excited to get my hands on a copy of this because I also understand that The Mythic Masculine, my podcast, was somewhat of a little inspiration for it. And she's also written another book, which is an eco-feminist historical fiction, reimagining the Gospels, The Madonna Secret, which will also be published, I believe, next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, well then, away we go here on the first Crow's Nest. Again, this is meant to be a show to wonder about things, topical and happening, and certainly one of the kind of clear, tragic happenings that has occurred very recently, I guess the last 48 hours, is the shooting in Texas. And, I'll just say, I get the New York Times sort of daily newsletter, and, that headline there was certainly arresting. When I first saw it, was something 19 children had been killed. And, at the same time, there's this, intersection of this familiarity, this tragic familiarity of this kind of thing that seems to occur with some alarming regularity, particularly within the United States. I'll just out myself too, as I'm a Canadian as well. I'm a Canadian citizen. I live in Canada, and so don't have the same understanding or the same growing up in the same climate as that. But I think it would behoove us to shed some light on this happening in light of many of the topics that we've explored together: masculinity, culture, and see what we can do. Now, Sophie, maybe you could share a little too of when you heard the news, and maybe sketch out a little bit of the details that you understand.
Yeah, I understand that the mental illness argument, which is pretty bioessentialist, is being used, and it's ableist, and it complicates and paves over the inheritance of violence upon which America is founded and is going to perpetrate inside every system. It focuses on the individual and their problems and their genetics rather than on the system that will constantly reproduce this violence again and again and again until we dismantle it. I don't remember where I was. I think it hit me so intensely. I was at my computer working probably, and the news alert came up. There's that feeling in your stomach every time you see that. You think, really? Truly? And, just in my home state, just 2 weeks ago, we had that incredibly racist shooting happen. It's beginning to feel, I went to a very intense high school that was really, it was small, it was rural, it was underprivileged. 15 people from my graduating class OD'd and died. And we had lots of events when I was growing up with bomb threats and kids being extraordinarily violent. And it was not the kids that were necessary. It was not about locating that kid and de-escalating that kid. It was about being in the entire ecosystem of harm that was manifesting these violent events again and again. So, yeah. What about you? What were you?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yeah, I got the newsletter in the morning. This is,
Yeah.
when I woke up and in my inbox. And yeah, I'll just say again that I have a young son now as well. He's 3.5, so he's not, school age. But certainly it's much easier for me to imagine myself in the shoes of those parents and to be utterly devastated. I can't even imagine, what that would feel like. Um, to have to wonder again as they did. I understand, after the shooting happened, to wonder if their child was alive or not. Um, and as I began to read some of the commentary, there's some of the typical stuff that you hear, like you said. I mean, the details seem familiar as well. A young man, I believe, I don't know, I think maybe 20, around that age, isolated, alone, or mostly alone, few friends, easy access to assault weapons. Like there's something in that archetype that seems really, clearly to reoccur again and again. And I was reading another piece that was essentially highlighting the other factors which seem to be also in these kinds of events, is that the youth, in this case the young man, grows up without a significant father figure, or some kind of presence of maybe a strong as in healthy masculine role model in their days. And that seems to be a significant significant variable in young men's predisposition to violence, is actually the absence of a father figure or some strong male role models. And so it's interesting to track, of course, the commentary that comes out of, on the one hand, because when we hear things like we have to dismantle patriarchy, right? Patriarchy is the problem, and on the other hand, you also hear it's actually the absence of fathering that is the problem. According to this other dynamic, it becomes it almost seems like completely different realities. And so again, I wonder how might we wonder about this, from that mythopoetic lens. I mean, you spoke about the ecosystem aspect as well, which I really appreciated, because I'll just make a link here that one thing I've heard you say around mythology is this idea that, that these characters or these gods, they kind of, they're fruiting bodies of a particular place and time, but that they come from this almost mythological substructure. And for me, as I reflect on that, and also these situations of these, mass shooting events, which in this case, I saw a chart in the New York Times. It was, since '98 or something, it was something like 101 shootings compared to almost every other industrialized country was, a handful, maybe less than 10. And so what is it within the American almost mythological substructure, which these are the fruiting bodies of? It seems to be these kinds of events, where these men just become the vectors of that. And why is it important to be able to see it from that lens?
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I very strongly believe that violence doesn't leave, that when there is a violent act on a piece of land that isn't ritually digested and understood and moved, and that energy isn't moved, and instead it's suppressed and erased and ignored, it will find a way to keep talking. And I think a lot that myth and storytelling and human behavior sometimes is the land talking through us, or certain types of resonances in the land. And I think of America as being a place that's soaked in blood, so many different types of violence and blood, ecological blood that, colonizers came in and terraformed and destroyed incredible biodiverse tangled ecosystems. So we have ecocide that is the basis of America. We have genocide of the indigenous people, and then the erasure of their stories. And then we have slavery. We have eugenicist, ableist, sexist, puritanical inheritances. We have witch trials. I mean, we have so much violence that is dispersed in this land and has never been digested, acknowledged, or moved. And so I'm unsurprised. I'm horrified, but unsurprised that it keeps occurring. It needs somewhere to pop up. It's shouting. A thing that I feel, the more and more of these events we see, the more I feel that America, it's not about amending the legal system or trying to use this violent infrastructure to somehow tamp down this violence, it will show up somewhere else. I mean, I think the truth is, yes, our children in America were killed, but we are killing children and killing entire ecosystems every day with our military capitalist infrastructure. And we can ban guns for human beings, and those guns are still going to be used to suppress other countries in order to dominate the globe. And so I think it's important that we not forget that this individual act of violence has a root system in a systemic global colonial violence that is happening every minute, every day. I lost you, Ian.
Oh, hey. Oh, I believe we're back here.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay, there you are.
You still hear me okay?
I can't see you, but I can see a wall.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can fix this. Just one moment. Sorry about that.
See you.
Okay.
There we are.
How's that?
Great.
Aha.
Yeah.
We're still live. Beautiful. So how does one handle such a bracing litany of blood and destruction and ecocides and all the rest? I mean, I like that image what you said. I mean, until violence is, I can't remember exact, digested or the word you used. Yeah, how does one begin to approach that work? In many ways, feels the spirit work of the times in a meaningful way.
I don't have a ready answer, and I think that's also the whole idea of capitalist patriarchy is that we can have stable value systems, find an answer, proceed, progress, proceed, techno-narcissistic, fix everything. I don't have an answer, and I think that's part of the answer is not having an answer. That I know that we have to howl, we have to grieve, and we have to stop doing everything. I mean, I think that I think that inaction is actually a very powerful thing to do right now. To stop buying stuff, to stop paying your taxes, to stop participating. But at the end of the day, I don't really have an answer right now. I'm definitely speaking from a place where I feel anguished and confused and paralyzed. I don't know if you have a sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the recent Martin Shaw essay that I believe you read as well, he spoke of this sense of the difference between, I think it was either, being with uncertainty and navigating the mysteries.
Yeah.
Right, and there was some kind of invitation in the latter, and some kind of stuckness in the former. And so, yeah, I see this as so much a part of the times. And speaking again from a maybe it's a sort of a personal but a mythological context, personal meaning to the individual. I interviewed a fellow, he's based in Scandinavia, who works a lot with men, and particularly younger men, and he offers a kind of invitation into the archetypal map that largely made popular by Douglas Gillette and Robert Moore, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover.
Yeah.
Right? It's very familiar to men's scene, and I know you and I have also spoken about the wild man, right, as an archetype. As mentioned in Robert Bly's book, Iron John. And in a conversation I had with this fellow, his name's Ivan Skellum, he spoke about how the young men, of course, desire a kind of greatness or some kind of consequence in the world. And that it is the absence of that invitation to be of consequence, right? That is that sort of deep loss or sort of deep longing at the heart often of these kinds of actions. At least this is what we circled in that conversation, because I can't think of a more sort of disconnected act than something like this, right, where this fellow walks into an elementary school and basically turns others, in this case many young children, into its. And by that, I was recently listening to another interview, and they just talked about this idea of I, thou, and I think I, it, right? This idea of being able to grant a kind of agency and sovereignty to another individual or being, non-human, versus the I, it, whereas essentially they're just a tool, at your disposal. And so there's something in the such an extreme disconnect from feeling of consequence in this case by a young man, and it's often young men in these stories, that somehow just precedes this act of absolute consequence and mayhem, right? That will, and oftentimes I understand they end up being killed in these things. And so their wake of this kind of action is going to ripple for generations, certainly within the sphere of those directly affected. But there's something to not miss, I suppose, that not as a way of, say, absolving at all those kinds of actions, but it's kind of like without addressing that young men have this deep longing to feel of consequence, and how do we actually craft a culture of consequence? It leads me to, again, this quote, Michael Meade, who's done a lot of work with this. He often uses this phrase, but he says something like, if young men aren't invited into consequence in a way in the village, they'll burn it down to feel the warmth. Right? They're chilling words, held in this context like this, but again, so for me, it is this ecosystem, this cultural ecosystem of consequence that I also see real consequence, not, pseudo consequence, not, environmental domination, as upheld as an achievement in this case for men, as an example. But anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I've been thinking a lot lately about how there are so many important roles that no longer exist, and so people feel that they have no purpose. That we don't have storytellers, we don't have shepherds, we don't have the people who hold together a small community. I mean, there are small jobs with a big weight behind them that have disappeared, and small roles. And they're roles that are contextualized by community, not by a global technocratic state, by community, knitting together community. And I've been thinking a lot about certain men in my life who I think would fit into a village setting very, very well. And, that it's not about being of consequence in the globe or the country. It's about being of consequence in your community. But we have fractionated communities. We don't have community anymore. So there's no, and I think it's interesting, in a really woven relational community, if someone without a father figure is never actually without a father figure, because there are so many other elders available. And we've talked about this before, is that, in a village setting where the nuclear family doesn't bear the burden of correctly raising a child, there are a lot of different people to help you find your role. And I think a lot of young men is not having roles anymore. They've disappeared into technology, into computers, into artifice. And I really do think the answer is about mutual aid, not the government is never going to solve this. Looking to weaving men back into their community and showing them that there are more interesting roles for them that aren't just about being a breadwinner, about creating violence and dominating, but perhaps it's about creating community theater, being the gardener, being the person who watches after the kids, who watches after the animals that the community shares. I mean, I think there are so many. I look at myths and I look at mythic structures, and I've been creating a course about Second Temple period Palestine, and thinking about how there were so many roles that were considered masculine at that time period that don't even exist anymore. There was, a bunch of town rabbis, and that wasn't even a spiritual term. That was you were in charge of the cultural inheritance and keeping it alive through oral conversation. There were the shepherds. There were, there were the people who looked after the animals, the people who looked after the gardens, the people who made your tables for you. We don't have that. And of course, we still have carpenters and people who practice animal husbandry, but it's in a deracinated way where you're doing this for people you'll never meet, and you're not in touch with what you're doing. And so I've been thinking more and more that it's not just, I think it's hard. I've become increasingly wary of the term patriarchy, because I think it's so much bigger than patriarchy. It's anthropocentrism, it's imperialism. And I think that patriarchy, it's a reactionary term. It goes deeper than that. We're all culpable right now. We're all harming the earth. Some of us shoot up schools, and some of us, pretend like we can, live this unsustainable plastic life where we never have to deal with our waste products. That's also deeply, deeply violent. The violence has gradients and scales, but none of us are pure. And I think in a
Mm.
moment like this, there's an impulse to think of violence as being always super easy to locate and see. And it's when someone kills a lot of people. But we are all violent right now. The culture requires us to be violent. And no matter how many gun laws we pass, we are going to be enacting this violence every time we participate in this industrial capitalist system.
Mm. Thanks for that. I'm struck by, I believe Bayo Komolafe had a term. He called it networks of suffering. That we are involved in networks of suffering, and so
Yeah.
many that we don't see.
Yeah.
We, as in in industrial capitalism, they deliberately create distance, right,
Yeah.
between that. And in some ways, that's the great tragedy, in a way, of the genius of humanness. I think when there's an actual face-to-face encounter, or when you can actually be in the presence of your consequence, right? Because there's generally there's a kind of, I don't know if it's mirror neurons, right? All these ways in which you sort of feel like, oh, wow, when you're willing to be open or porous enough, you can say, wow, like I've affected this person, or, this is the consequence of my action. But because of the distancing and the separation and the fragmentation, it's very hard to be aware of your consequence. And in fact, billions of dollars are made on kind of keeping the veil over that level of consequence. You also spoke about this idea of, you could maybe call them masculine roles, or masculine archetypes, say within certain cultural frameworks. For example, I know Sharon Blackie, for example, the mythologist, as well as Pat McCabe, Indigenous grandmother. In the conversations I've had with them on my Mythic Masculine podcast, they've spoken to this idea of these resurgence of certain masculine archetypes that hold very different values, very different roles within the culture. And I think Sharon Blackie spoke of this idea of, it wasn't shepherd, but it was almost like the blacksmith, I think it was,
Yeah.
right? Almost like, like the craftsman, again, held up in esteem. And Pat McCabe has spoken about to be architects of the dream, right? Or to be guardians, like all of these like necessary roles that actually embedded within deep relational networks of meaning, that is actually much more fulfilling than all of these other lofty kind of pseudo achievements, right? That the culture kind of says, okay, that's aim at that. And so I have a question for you, which is, like, what do you see as first? Is it a mythological, a cultural story that therefore allows for these archetypal emergences, right, to begin to register and in some ways become attractors in the field, right? Of like, oh, I didn't know I could do that, for example. Is it a mythological story, cultural structure that does it, or is, the archetypes arise and the sort of cultural framework story along with it?
I very strongly believe that the ecological wisdom of one place cannot be transplanted to another place. That, we're all connected, but not everything is connected to everything in the same way. And I think there will be different archetypes and roles for different communities and places, with different trees and plants and animals and social ideas and mythic. I believe that there are spirits and animist entities that live in places and have different requirements. I mean, where I live in the Hudson Valley, the Munsee Lenape called this energy Manitou. And I believe that there are Manitou archetypes in the Hudson Valley that couldn't be transplanted to where you are. So I think that what it really comes down to is beginning to come back into our root systems where we are locally. I mean, I really think that local potlucks, getting involved with foraging, protecting wild species, growing your own food, creating networks of mutual aid and sustainability where you are. And as those networks, like mycorrhizal systems, begin to connect people, information is flowing between species, between, different people from different backgrounds. Those archetypes will begin to emerge in place, situated in place. Fungi don't have a body plan. When you pour them into a ecosystem, they form a map of relationships. And I think that I'm less interested in archetypes as individuals and more about archetypal fungal systems, relational systems that suddenly bring everyone into their correct ecological niche. And so I think it's really about building community in really practical, not very sexy ways. And the myths will come. Stories always arrive as you learn that there are certain rhythms of times when you harvest things. There are moments when different flowers flower. There are moments to notice certain astrological events from a certain vantage point. And I think that as people become aware of where they are and who they're in relationship with, the stories to explain and contextualize that will emerge. I don't know if you have a deep understanding of myth through your conversations with many different people in your own work, and I'm wondering what your experience of these new archetypes is.
Yeah, thanks for that. One thing that did occur to me too as you were speaking, I'd love to just hear first is, from that understanding of, you said, these fungal ecosystems, is it possible to consider, to wonder, is toxic masculinity a kind of fungal rot
I think
within the
it's like
ecosystem?
Candida. I think my thing I always talk about is narrative dysbiosis. When you give someone too many antibiotics, it doesn't just kill off the bad stuff, it kills off the good stuff, and it leaves open too much space in the cultural gut. So that monologuing pathogens that normally are held at bay by a healthy microbiome are given too much space. So like Candida, thrush, yeast, which is fungus, can take over and really harm someone. And I think that toxic masculinity has been really paired with antibiotic culture, paired with colonialism, has been really good at killing off all the other stories so that it has too much space to spread out. And I think that it's not like we're going to be able to kill off toxic masculinity. It's about adding in a probiotic of so many other stories, so many other perspectives, that it's kept in the corner, that it's neutralized.
Yeah, thanks for that. I like that, because it does seem that almost like a universalist response can also, like in a way, destroy the good bacteria, or maybe
Yeah.
the good life forms that are within, quote, masculinity. Like, this is the part that I think often is tough to navigate within a cultural framework. That
Yeah.
is, hey, we're back. Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah, sorry. The that wants to cancel bad behavior. For example, through a kind of, I call it like a universalist, like that's all of it's wrong, it's bad, as opposed to, in some ways, enhancing the good probiotic, elements that you spoke to. So yeah, there's something in that. Like, it's not it's not an accident that we use the word culture for, I don't know, kombucha and other, like,
Yeah.
organism systems, and culture as in human culture. Like, there's obviously sharing similar patterns there. And to your question then again, yeah, what have I noticed as well? I think in the conversations I've held within,
Yeah.
yeah, certainly, that was my attempt with the Mythic Masculine podcast, was actually to begin to bring in these other perspectives and other stories, other archetypal ways, as a way of filling out the conversation, right? And perhaps in some ways there's a certain aspirational reason for that, like, as in, it seems easier to move towards what you like, instead of sort of blocking, or canceling that which is no good in some ways, right? So I definitely see the value of that, and I recognize as well that how do we tend the ecosystem itself will then, what becomes the outputs, or the fruits, right, of that ecosystem. It's either naturally life enhancing or continually life destroying, right? And I think that's probably sort of the overall theme, I think, of our conversation here. That these isolated events, while horrific, are also sort of built within a system. That this is the nature of the system, and that these are simply just the blossoms of that. And so, yeah, how do we continually to tend the ecosystem of culture that actually blossoms forth in ways that enhance life?
That's beautifully put. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, the thing I've been saying recently is I work by process of addition, not subtraction. that I don't think we can sterilize or clean things and suddenly make them morally pure. That we have to, Anna Singh and Donna Haraway, some of my favorite theorists, say we have to learn to live in this mess. We have to learn to work with it. We can't erase it. We're entangled with it. And that's why compost heap is a metaphor I always return to, which is like, there's bad stuff on that compost heap, but if you throw enough on, something is going to sprout. And I think that's why we need to learn how to have conversations between ideas, and to throw a lot of different perspectives, not just two. I mean, like, it's, I enjoy conversations where it's two people talking, because that's very manageable and legible for other people. But what we really need to be doing is having conversations where 30 people are dialoguing and learning how to do that. Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll have 30 on the Crow's Nest in a future edition. But let's keep it there then. This is the nature of this lean first edition here in the Crow's Nest. Sophie, really appreciate you being here. How about you spend a little bit of time just saying, where people can find more of your work?
Well, thank you so much, Ian. It's helpful for me to digest and move this. We think of cultural bodies like bodies that hold trauma. Like, you have to shiver, you have to move, you have to let this stuff move through you. So thank you. You can find me on my website, sophiestrand.com. I'm on Instagram at Cosmogyny, COSMOGYNY. And I have a book coming out, so come and bother me. I usually like to talk to my readers. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. And one final announcement as well. Once again, this Crow's Nest is somewhat of an outgrowth of the School of Mythopoetics, which is officially launching next week, June 1st. And if you want to get in, check out, on the website, we have a lot there of what the school is all about, this kind of mythopoetic way of practice, of immersion, and understanding. And so, we have a founding member rate. If you'd like to join us, please consider. And these kinds of conversations, these kinds of guests, this is the soil where so much of this hopefully can, turn into something that is life-enhancing and really needed, in these times. Okay, we'll end it there. Once again, thanks, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Ian.